He was a king with a heart of stone, ruling a kingdom of glass. But when billionaire Frank Sterling saw the crude copper wire on his new maid's finger, his breath hitched. He had spent 20 years erasing his past, but that piece of blue glass was a ghost he couldn't kill. The woman cleaning his floors wasn't a stranger. She was the girl he had abandoned in the dark. The signature on the contract was worth $400 million, but Frank Sterling's hand didn't tremble until he looked at the screen. In the high-stakes world of Chicago real estate, Frank was known as the executioner. He had fired 17 employees that month without a single blink of his icy blue eyes. To the world, he was a man without a heart, a machine built of ambition and expensive wool suits. He had destroyed competitors and crushed negotiations until there was nothing left but his own reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. But as he stared at the security footage on his laptop, the air seemed to leave the room. His new maid was simply wiping down the marble kitchen counter. It was a routine motion, invisible and mundane, except for the ring on her finger. It wasn't a diamond. It wasn't gold. It was a crude, oxidized copper wire wrapped around a jagged piece of blue glass. To any other billionaire, it was trash. To Frank, it was a siren blaring from a past he had buried in a shallow grave 20 years ago. It was a ring he had twisted with his own bleeding fingers in the basement of an orphanage for a girl he had once sworn to marry. Frank Sterling owned half of the skyline. His name commanded silence in boardrooms and fear in the streets. His net worth exceeded what most people could imagine in 10 lifetimes. Yet he couldn't sleep. Every night he lay in his California king bed, surrounded by the finest Egyptian cotton and absolute, suffocating silence, staring at the ceiling until the gray Chicago dawn crept through the glass. His doctors offered pills. His therapists suggested meditation. Nothing worked. Control was the only drug Frank craved. Control over every atom of his existence, down to the exact temperature of his morning espresso and the precise angle of the lamp on his mahogany desk. That obsession with control was why he had fired his entire household staff 3 weeks ago. One of them had leaked a minor detail to a tabloid. He didn't care to find out which one. He simply eliminated the entire group. His assistant, a nervous young man named Liam, had presented him with a stack of applications for a new housekeeper. "I need someone who doesn't exist," Frank had barked, not looking up from his legal briefs. "Someone who won't talk, won't ask questions, and won't try to occupy the space I breathe in. Someone invisible." Liam had found exactly that. Elena Vance, 36 years old. 15 years of experience working for the most elite, secretive families in Manhattan and Chicago. There wasn't a single complaint in her file. More importantly, there wasn't a single employer who could actually remember what her face looked like. She was a phantom. Perfect. Elena arrived on a cold Tuesday morning carrying a single, small bag and wearing a simple dress the color of wood smoke. Frank didn't even acknowledge her presence. He had Liam show her to the staff quarters and explain the ironclad rules. No conversation unless addressed. No presence in the rooms he occupied. No personal effects allowed in common areas. She nodded once, a sharp, silent gesture, and began to work. For the first week, Frank barely noticed she was there. She moved through the 5,000-square-foot penthouse like a ghost, cleaning surfaces he didn't even know were dirty and organizing spaces he had long forgotten existed. He would enter a room and find it subtly transformed. He could never pinpoint the change, but the lighting seemed softer. The air carried a faint, nameless scent that felt oddly comforting, and his meals appeared at precise intervals. Simple, rustic dishes that tasted like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. On the 8th night, the impossible happened. Frank Sterling slept for 6 uninterrupted hours. He woke up confused, almost panicked. His body felt strange, lighter, as if a weight he had carried since the age of 16 had been temporarily lifted by invisible hands. He told himself it was a fluke, a coincidence of chemistry. But then it happened again, and again. By the third week, the man who prided himself on being untouchable found himself consumed by curiosity about the woman who had altered the very atmosphere of his home without making a sound. He began checking the security cameras, not because he suspected her of theft, but because he was fascinated by her efficiency. He watched her work. She moved with a quiet, lethal grace, never wasting emotion. She hummed no songs, she talked to no one. She displayed no personality, no ego, no spark, except for one thing. The ring. She wore it constantly. That crude copper band with the blue glass stone never left her finger. Not when she was scrubbing the industrial-grade floors, not when her hands were buried in soapy water, not even when she slept. It was clearly a piece of junk, the kind of thing a child would make as a forgotten school project. Yet she protected it as if it were the most precious artifact on the planet. It was a Thursday evening when the camera finally caught it in high definition. Frank was reviewing the day's footage when Alina reached up to dust a high shelf in his study. The sunlight hit the ring. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. The copper wire was twisted in a specific, jagged pattern, 3 loops crossing over each other before anchoring the stone. The blue glass wasn't a jewel. It was a shard from a broken, sapphire-colored bottle, cut at an odd angle with one corner slightly chipped. He knew that pattern. He knew that chip. He had made them himself 20 years ago in the damp basement of St. Jude's orphanage. He closed his laptop, then snapped it open again. His hands were shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of his desk. St. Jude. He hadn't allowed his mind to go back to that hellhole in 2 decades. He had spent millions to erase every record, changed his name from Miller to Sterling when the wealthy family adopted him, and built a fortress around his identity. But now the floodgates broke. The smell of industrial cleaner, the cold dormitory floors, the older boys who stole his bread, and the one person who made it bearable, Alina. She had been the quiet one, the easy target, and he had protected her not out of bravery, but because protecting her was the only thing that made him feel like he wasn't just another piece of trash waiting to be thrown away. They had been inseparable. They had sat on the fire escape and talked about a future where they owned the world. And on one freezing Christmas Eve, he had given her a promise made of copper and broken glass. "When I'm rich," he had whispered, his voice cracking with the sincerity of a boy who had nothing else to give. "I'll come back for you. I'll marry you. Keep this as proof." Now the billionaire looked at the screen. The girl was here. She was cleaning his floors. And he was the man who had traded her for a kingdom of glass. He had the power to buy her soul, but he was too terrified to ask for her name. Billionaire Frank Sterling wasn't just watching his maid anymore. He was hunting for a ghost. He set a trap made of memories, a psychological game to see if the woman with the copper ring would finally scream his name, or if she had already buried him in the past. The realization hit Frank Sterling like a physical blow to the solar plexus. He sat in the darkness of his study, the only light emanating from the cold glow of the security monitors. He looked at his own hands, the hands that signed multi-billion-dollar mergers, the hands that shook the world, and saw them trembling. He was the king of the East Coast, a man who had successfully erased every trace of the shivering orphan named Frankie Miller. But the copper ring on Alina Vance's finger was a key that had just unlocked a vault he thought was welded shut forever. He could walk into the kitchen right now. He could stand before her, reveal his identity, and ask her if she was the girl from St. Jude. But Frank was a man built on layers of armor. To reveal himself was to admit he was the boy who had abandoned her for a life of silk and silver. He was a predator who had bankrupted rivals and watched powerful men crumble, yet he couldn't find the courage to face a woman holding a microfiber cloth. He chose a different path, a path he called strategy, but deep down, he knew it was cowardice. He would test her. He would plant triggers, small fragments of their shared trauma, to see if she would break her silence. The first test, the blue shard. The next morning, Frank did something he never did. He entered the kitchen before she arrived. He placed a simple blue glass bottle on the pristine marble counter. It was a mass-produced item, worthless to anyone else, but it was the exact sapphire hue of the shard he had used to make her ring 20 years ago. He left the penthouse and spent the day in a boardroom, but his mind was on the security feed. That evening, he replayed the footage obsessively. Alina entered the kitchen at 7:15 a.m. She began her routine with mechanical precision, wiping the surfaces and organizing the fruit. Then her hand stopped. She was inches from the blue bottle. For exactly 4 seconds, she became a statue. She didn't gasp, she didn't cry, but her fingers hovered over the glass with a tenderness that spoke volumes. She picked it up as if it were made of thin ice and placed it carefully in the cabinet. Her face remained a mask of professional indifference, but those 4 seconds told Frank everything he needed to know. She remembered the blue glass. The second test, the ghost's melody. Frank's obsession grew darker. He found a rare, scratchy recording of Silent Night performed by a children's choir, the exact version that the nuns at St. Jude's had blasted through the rusty intercoms every Christmas. He set it as his morning alarm, turning the volume high enough to vibrate the very walls of the penthouse. He pretended to sleep in, watching the live feed on his phone from under the covers. Alina was in the study, dusting the heavy mahogany bookshelves. When the first haunting notes of the choir filled the room, her hand froze against the wood. Her eyes drifted toward the window, looking past the steel skyscrapers of the Chicago skyline, seeing something far away, perhaps a rusted fire escape in the snow. She stood there for a full minute, the dust cloth suspended in midair. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she straightened her shoulders and returned to her labor as if the music were nothing but wind. Frank felt a twist of agony in his chest. He couldn't tell if it was guilt or the intoxicating drug of hope. The third test, the final evidence. The third test was the most dangerous, a gamble that risked exposing his own soul. Frank had kept one single photograph from his past, hidden in a high-security safe deposit box for 2 decades. It was a grainy, winter-sun-bleached photo of the children at the orphanage. A skinny, scowling Frank was in the back. A small, wide-eyed Alina was 3 rows ahead. He placed the photograph on his desk, face up, surrounded by documents worth millions. He left it there like a landmine. That afternoon, he came home early and hid in his master's suite, his eyes glued to the security feed. Alina entered the study at 4:30 p.m. to empty the wastebasket. She saw the photo instantly. Her entire body went rigid, a stillness so absolute it was louder than a scream. She set down her basket and picked up the photograph with both hands, holding it like a sacred relic that might crumble into ash if she breathed too hard. Her thumb moved slowly across the faces of the children, stopping at 2 points Frank knew by heart, him and her. She stayed like that for a long time, her head bowed. When she finally set it down, she aligned it perfectly with the edge of the desk, exactly where she had found it. She finished her work and walked out without a word. She never mentioned it. She never asked. She never gave a sign that she had seen her own ghost staring back at her from his desk. That absolute commitment to remaining invisible, that devastating restraint, is what finally broke Frank Sterling. He realized that she wasn't just working for him, she was protecting him. She had likely known who he was from the moment she walked through the door, yet she had demanded nothing and expected nothing. She was still the girl on the fire escape, shielding him from the truth of the monster he had become. The distance between them became a physical ache. Every morning, the billionaire found excuses to linger in the kitchen. He would nurse a cold espresso, pretending to read the Wall Street Journal, while stealing glances at the woman who had once saved half her bread for him when he was too hungry to sleep. She acknowledged him with nothing but polite, professional nods, maintaining a wall of granite between employer and employee. He wanted to tear that wall down with his bare hands. He wanted to fall at her feet and beg for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. Instead, his voice would fail him, and he would simply ask her for more coffee, watching her walk away, the copper ring glinting mockingly in the light. He was the most powerful man in the city, but in the presence of Alina Vance, Frank Sterling was nothing but a coward in an expensive suit. And the biggest test, the one that would change everything, was only days away. The annual charity gala was coming, and the world was about to see what happened when a king finally knelt. He stood at the pinnacle of high society, surrounded by diamonds worth millions. But billionaire Frank Sterling's eyes were locked on a single piece of copper wire. The grand charity gala was supposed to be his triumph, but as the elite began to circle his invisible, Maid like sharks, Frank realized he wasn't just losing his composure. He was about to burn his entire world down to protect the girl he once abandoned. The Chicago Grand Charity Gala was a masterpiece of hypocrisy, and Frank Sterling hated every second of it. It was a night of forced smiles, hollow laughter, and the scent of expensive perfume masking the stench of greed. 300 of the city's most powerful people had paid $5,000 a plate to feel like saints for a night. The irony was like a blade in Frank's side. The theme was giving to underprivileged youth, yet the man hosting it had traded his own soul and the only girl he ever loved to escape that very life. Frank's publicist had insisted on the event to rehabilitate his image after his brutal firing of the previous household staff. He was supposed to be the philanthropist of the year, but as he stood in the center of the ballroom, he felt like a fraud in a $6,000 tuxedo. He had ordered Alina Vance to remain in the staff quarters. Her presence had become a distraction he couldn't afford, a living, breathing reminder of the boy he had murdered to become a king. But fate, it seemed, was tired of Frank's games. An hour into the event, his frantic catering manager approached him. "We're short-staffed, Mr. Sterling. 3 servers caught a virus. We need every hand on deck." A rational man, the executioner, would have ordered the manager to figure it out or fire someone else. But Frank felt a strange, magnetic pull. "Use whoever you have," he said, his voice a low growl. "Including my housekeeper." He lied to himself, telling his conscience it was a practical decision. In reality, he wanted to see her in his world. He wanted to see if the girl from the orphanage could survive the sharks of the Gold Coast. Alina appeared shortly after, wearing the standard black service dress provided by the caterers. She was, as always, a ghost. She carried a tray of champagne glasses through the glittering crowd with a quiet, lethal efficiency. To the billionaires and socialites, she was part of the furniture, a background element that existed only to serve. That was her survival mechanism, to be present but never seen. But Frank saw her. His eyes tracked her across the ballroom like a compass pointing true north. He ignored the CEOs pitching him mergers and the debutantes fluttering their lashes. He watched the way her hand steadied the tray, and more importantly, he watched the copper ring glinting under the crystal chandeliers. It looked out of place among the 5-carat diamonds and platinum bands, like a wildflower in a garden of plastic. That was when Victoria Ashford decided to strike. Victoria was old money, the kind of wealth that breeds a specific brand of cruelty. She had been nursing a grudge against Frank ever since he had rejected her business proposal 6 months prior. She was sharp with champagne and looking for a target to humiliate the man of the hour. She spotted Alina passing by and raised a hand, her voice cutting through the orchestral music like a whip. "You there, with the tray, come here." Alina stopped. Her face remained neutral, a mask of perfect service, but Frank saw the slight tension in her shoulders. She stepped toward Victoria's circle. Victoria didn't take a glass. Instead, she reached out and snatched Alina's hand, hoisting it up for her companions to see. "Ladies, look at this," Victoria sneered, her laughter like breaking glass. "The help is wearing jewelry, and what a piece it is. Tell me, dear, is this copper? Or did you find this at the bottom of a cereal box?" The circle of women erupted into cruel, tinkling laughter. Alina didn't pull away. She stood there, frozen, while the elite of Chicago mocked the only thing she had left of her soul. "Let me do you a favor," Victoria said, her eyes flashing with malice. "You'll never find a decent position or a husband wearing garbage like this." In one swift, violent motion, Victoria yanked the copper ring off Alina's finger. The tray in Alina's other hand tilted. Champagne glasses slid and shattered against the marble floor, the sound echoing like gunshots in the sudden silence of the nearby guests. Victoria tossed the ring carelessly over her shoulder. It hit the floor with a tiny, tinny sound and rolled away, disappearing under a long banquet table draped in silk. Alina dropped to her knees. She didn't care about the broken glass or the expensive champagne soaking into her dress. She scrambled toward the table, her composure finally, utterly shattered. "Look at her," Victoria laughed, gesturing to the floor. "Scrambling like an animal for a piece of wire." The ballroom went cold, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the man who was now walking toward them. Frank Sterling was moving with a purposeful, predatory gait that made the crowd part instinctively. There was a look in his eyes that no one in Chicago had ever seen, not the executioner, but something far more dangerous. He walked past Victoria as if she were a pillar of salt. He walked past the raised smartphones and the whispering guests. He walked directly to the mess of broken glass and spilled wine. And he did the one thing no one expected the most powerful man in the room to do. He knelt. On the cold, dirty marble floor, in his $6,000 suit, Frank Sterling went down on both knees beside his maid. He reached under the table, his fingers searching until they closed around the familiar, jagged twist of copper wire and blue glass. 20 years, it still felt the same. He looked at Alina. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Tears were finally blurring her vision. Frank didn't say a word to the crowd. He took her hand gently, the same hand he had held on a fire escape in Detroit, and slid the copper ring back onto her finger. Then he stood up. The ballroom was so silent you could hear the hum of the light fixtures. 300 billionaires stood frozen, champagne halfway to their lips. Frank turned to face Victoria Ashford, and his voice carried to the very back of the hall. "This ring," Frank said, his tone as sharp as a guillotine, "is worth more than every diamond in this room combined." He stepped closer to Victoria, who had gone pale. "And you just insulted the woman wearing it, in my home." "Frank, I didn't realize," Victoria stammered. "Get out," Frank interrupted. "Get out of my home and never expect an invitation to any event bearing the Sterling name again." As Victoria fled the room in a chorus of clicking heels, Frank turned back to Alina and offered his hand to help her up. The world was watching, but in that moment, the architect of silence had finally found his voice. The gala was over, but the war for his soul had just begun. Billionaire Frank Sterling had knelt before the world, but when the sun rose, the penthouse was empty. Alina was gone, leaving behind nothing but a letter that burned hotter than any headline. He thought his money could fix the past, but he was about to learn that some wounds are too deep for a checkbook to heal. The morning after the gala, the city of Chicago was buzzing. The executioner had knelt. The man of stone had cracked. Headlines in every tabloid and business journal featured a grainy photo of Frank Sterling on his knees in spilled champagne, holding the hand of a maid. His PR team was in a frenzy, Liam's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from board members demanding to know if their CEO had suffered a nervous breakdown. But inside the penthouse, there was only a terrifying, hollow silence. Frank woke up not with the usual cold precision of a billionaire, but with the frantic heartbeat of a boy who had lost his way. He didn't check the stock market. He didn't look at his emails. He ran to the kitchen, his silk robe fluttering behind him. "Alina," he called out. His voice, usually a tool of command, sounded thin and desperate. The kitchen was spotless. The marble counters gleamed like bone. The blue glass bottle he had used to test her was gone. The coffee machine was cold. He hurried to the staff quarters, a wing of the penthouse he had never set foot in. The door was open. The small, modest room was stripped bare. The bed was made with military precision. No bags, no clothes, no trace that a human being had lived there for 3 weeks. On the small wooden desk, there was a single envelope. It wasn't addressed to Mr. Sterling. It was addressed to Frankie. Frank's knees buckled. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and painfully familiar. "I didn't come here for an apology, Frankie," the letter began. "And I certainly didn't come for your money. When I saw your name on the agency's list of clients, I told myself I was coming to see what kind of man you had become. I wanted to see if the boy who spent 3 days' worth of bread money to buy a piece of copper wire was still alive inside the billionaire." Frank let out a ragged sob, his head dropping into his hands. "I saw the tests you set for me," the letter continued. "The blue bottle, the music, the photograph. You were hunting me, Frankie. You were waiting for me to break so you could feel better about leaving me behind 20 years ago. But I stayed silent because I wanted to see if you would choose me when it wasn't a game. Last night at the gala, you finally did. You chose a maid over the elite. You chose a piece of wire over your reputation. And for that, I can finally forgive you." Frank felt a surge of hope, but the next sentence crushed it. "But I cannot stay. I won't be a secret kept in a penthouse. I won't be the charity case the world talks about. I loved a boy named Frankie Miller, but I don't know the man named Frank Sterling. Don't look for me. Let the memory of last night be our real goodbye. You kept your promise, you became rich. Now try to become happy." Frank stared at the paper until the words blurred. The executioner had everything: the towers, the private jets, the billions in the bank, and he had never been more bankrupt in his life. He realized that for 20 years, he had been building a cage, not a kingdom. Every luxury was a bar. Every million was a lock. He had reached the top of the mountain only to find it was made of ice, and the only person who knew how to keep him warm had walked out the door. He didn't call his security team to track her phone. He didn't call the police. He knew Alina. If she wanted to disappear, she would become a shadow again. But he also knew something else. He knew where ghosts went when they had nowhere else to go. He called Liam. "Cancel my meetings, all of them, for the rest of the week." "Sir, the board is meeting about the gala incident at 10. "Tell the board they can have the company," Frank barked, his voice regaining its steel, but this time it was fueled by purpose, not greed. "I'm going to Detroit." The drive from Chicago to Detroit took 5 hours, but for Frank, it felt like 20 years. He drove himself, leaving the armored SUV and the driver behind. He drove an old sedan he had bought in cash from a lot on the outskirts of the city. He wanted to feel the vibration of the road. He wanted to feel the grit of the real world. As he crossed the city limits of Detroit, the glass towers of Chicago felt like a dream. Here, the buildings were scarred by time. The air smelled of rain and rust. He drove past the boarded-up windows and the empty lots until he reached the corner of 4th and Vine. St. Jude's orphanage. It was no longer an orphanage. It was a community center now, painted in bright, fatting colors. But the fire escape was still there. the rusted iron stairs where he had once told a girl she was his entire world. He parked the car and walked toward the building. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a $6,000 suit. He was wearing jeans and a simple black sweater. He looked like a man, not a monument. He sat on the bottom step of the fire escape and waited. He didn't know if she was there. He didn't know if she would ever come. But for the first time in 2 decades, Frank Sterling wasn't running. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows over the cracked pavement. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps on the gravel. A woman in a wood-smoke-colored dress was walking toward the entrance, carrying a small bag of groceries. She stopped 10 feet away. The copper ring on her finger caught the last light of the dying sun. "You're a hard man to hide from, Frankie Miller," she said softly. Frank stood up, his heart echoing the rhythm of the city. "I'm not here as a billionaire, Alina. I'm here because I'm cold. And I think you're the only one who knows where I left my coat 20 years ago." He offered her a blank check, and she tore it into pieces. Billionaire Frank Sterling had conquered the business world, but standing in a crumbling Detroit hallway, he was just a beggar. He realized that to win back the girl with the copper ring, he had to do the one thing he feared most. He had to stop being a billionaire and start being a human. The hallway of the apartment building smelled of floor wax and old wood, a sharp contrast to the sterile, scent-engineered air of Frank's Chicago penthouse. Alina Vance stood in her doorway, the grocery bag still in her arms, looking at Frank as if he were a ghost that had refused to stay buried. She didn't invite him in. She didn't scream. She simply waited, her silence a wall more formidable than any security system Frank had ever paid for. "I didn't come to bring you back to the penthouse, Alina," Frank said, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. He felt out of place in his expensive leather shoes on the cracked linoleum. "I came to ask why you didn't tell me, all those weeks. You knew it was me. You saw the man I became. Why didn't you say my name?" Alina finally stepped back, gesturing for him to enter a small, sun-drenched kitchen. It was humble, but it had a warmth his $5 million kitchen lacked. She set the groceries down and turned to him. "Because I didn't recognize you, Frank. I recognized the face. I recognized the eyes. But the boy who made me that ring didn't have a heart made of ice. He didn't test people. He didn't fire people to feel in control. He loved the world, even when the world hated him. I stayed silent because I was mourning him." The words cut deeper than any corporate betrayal. Frank looked at his hands, the hands that had built an empire but had forgotten how to hold something fragile. "I did it for us," he whispered, a desperate plea in his eyes. "Every dollar, every building, every person I crushed. I told myself I was doing it so no one could ever hurt us again. I was building a wall so high that the orphanage couldn't reach us." "But you built the wall between us too," Alina replied softly. She held up her hand, the copper wire glinting. "I kept this because it was the only thing that was real. Your money, your towers, they aren't real, Frank. They're just shadows you used to hide from the boy who was scared of the dark." Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder. "I've already started the paperwork. I'm stepping down as CEO. I'm turning St. Jude into a fully funded foundation. I'm selling the penthouse. I'll give it all away if that's what it takes." Alina didn't look at the folder. She looked at him. "You're still trying to buy your way back into my life, Frank. You think a foundation fixes 20 years of silence. You think giving away money you don't need makes you the boy I loved. You're still negotiating. You're still the executioner." She walked to the window, looking out at the Detroit streets. "If you want to be in my life, you don't do it with a signature. You do it by standing in the rain without an umbrella. You do it by being nobody. Can you be a nobody for me, Frank? Or is the billionaire the only thing left of you?" Frank felt the weight of his entire life crashing down. He had spent 2 decades convincing himself that his net worth was his self-worth. To be nobody was his greatest fear. It meant being the orphan again. It meant being vulnerable. "I don't know how," Frank admitted, his voice breaking. "Then learn," Alina said. She walked to the door and opened it. "The boy I knew was brave. The man in front of me is just rich. Come back when you find the difference." Frank walked out of that apartment feeling smaller than he ever had. He returned to his car, but he didn't drive back to the airport. He drove to a motel on the edge of town. He sat in a room that cost $60 a night, staring at the flickering neon sign outside. He realized he had been playing a game where he held all the cards, but Alina had just flipped the table. For the next week, the world's media went into a tailspin. Billionaire Frank Sterling missing. Sterling stocks plummet. Is the executioner dead? Frank ignored it all. He turned off his phone. He walked the streets of his old neighborhood. He ate at diners where the waitresses didn't know his name. He sat in the park and watched people living lives that didn't involve mergers or acquisitions. He felt the cold. He felt the hunger. He felt the terrifying, beautiful lightness of having nothing to lose. On the 7th day, he returned to Alina's door. He didn't have a folder. He didn't have a suit. He was wearing a second-hand jacket and carrying a small, dented metal toolbox he had found at a garage sale. When she opened the door, she looked at his tired eyes, his unkempt hair, and the toolbox in his hand. "What's this?" she asked. "The sink in the community center, the old orphanage, is leaking," Frank said. "I spent the morning fixing it. I'm not a billionaire today, Alina. I'm just a guy who knows how to use a wrench, and I was wondering if you'd like to go get a burger with Frankie Miller. I only have $20, so you might have to share the fries." A slow, genuine smile spread across Alina's face. The first real smile Frank had seen in 20 years. It was brighter than any gala, more valuable than any skyscraper. "I like fries," she said softly. She reached out and took his hand, not the hand of a CEO, but the hand of the boy who had once promised her the moon and was now finally offering her the truth. But as they walked down the stairs, Frank's past wasn't finished with him yet. A black SUV was idling at the curb, and Liam was stepping out with a look of pure terror on his face. "Mr. Sterling, you have to come back. There's been a hostile takeover. They're trying to erase you." Frank didn't even stop. He kept walking, his fingers intertwined with Alina. "Let them," he called back over his shoulder. "I've already been found." The board of directors thought they were hunting a broken man. They didn't realize they were cornering a wolf who finally had something to protect. Billionaire Frank Sterling had walked away from his empire, but when his past tried to destroy the woman he loved, he returned to the boardroom for one final, bloodless execution. The black SUV idling at the curb was a piece of the world Frank Sterling had just tried to incinerate. Liam, his assistant, looked like a man who had seen his own execution. He was clutching a tablet as if it were a life raft. "Sir, you don't understand," Liam stammered, his eyes darting to Alina. "The board, they've invoked the sanity clause. They're claiming your disappearance and the gala incident prove you're mentally unfit. Julian Vane is leading the vote. They're liquidating your personal assets. They're trying to take everything, Frank, the penthouse, the cars, the St. Jude's Foundation funds." Frank felt the cold grip of his old life trying to drag him back under. Julian Vane was a man he had mentored, a snake Frank had taught how to strike. Julian didn't care about the company, he cared about the crown. But when Liam mentioned the St. Jude's funds, the money Frank had set aside to fix the orphanage, the fire in Frank's chest changed from guilt to pure, unadulterated rage. Alina felt the shift in him. She tightened her grip on his hand. "Frankie," she whispered, "you don't have to do this for me." "I'm not doing it for you, Alina," Frank said, his voice dropping an octave, returning to the tone that once made billionaires tremble. "I'm doing it for the boy who promised you a future. If I let them take that money, I'm letting them kill him all over again. He turned to Liam. Is the board meeting still in session? Yes, sir. Via video conference in the Detroit satellite office, 3 blocks from here. Frank looked at Alina. Wait for me at the diner, the one with the blue sign. I have to finish this. Frank, she said, her eyes searching his. Don't become the monster again to defeat one. The monster is gone, Alina, Frank said, leaning in to kiss her forehead. I'm just the janitor now, and I'm going to clean up the trash. Frank stepped into the SUV. Within 5 minutes, he was standing in the lobby of a glass-walled skyscraper that bore his own name. The security guards, recognizing the man they thought was missing, froze. Frank didn't wait for an escort. He walked straight to the executive floor, his heart beating with a calm, steady rhythm. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. The room was filled with screens. Julian Vane was at the head of the table, his face twisted into a smug grin as he spoke to the holographic projections of the board members. And so, given the CEO's clear abandonment of duty and erratic behavior. I'm not erratic, Julian, Frank's voice cut through the room like a cold front. I'm just selective about who I spend my time with. The room went dead silent. Julian turned, his face turning the color of ash. Frank, we heard reports you were unwell. You heard I was happy, Frank said, walking to the head of the table. He didn't sit. He stood over Julian, his presence filling the room. I spent 20 years building this company into a weapon. I taught you how to use it. But you forgot one thing, Julian. I own the patents, I own the land, and most importantly, I own the debt. Frank leaned down, his face inches from Julian's. You're trying to seize my assets based on a sanity clause? Let's talk about sanity. Is it sane to embezzle $6 million from the West Coast expansion to cover your gambling debts in Macau? Julian's eyes went wide. That's a lie. I have the ledger, Julian. I've had it for months, Frank said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. I was going to let it go. I was going to let you have the chair because I didn't want it anymore. But then you touched the St. Jude's Fund. You tried to take money from children to save your own skin. Frank looked at the screens, addressing the board members. Julian Vane is fired, effective immediately. Not because I'm the CEO, but because I am the primary shareholder and I am dissolving the board. I am taking Sterling Industries private. I'm selling 60% of the holdings to the Global Education Fund. The rest will be managed by a trust. You can't do that, Julian screamed, standing up. You'll be worth nothing. You'll be just another guy on the street. Frank smiled, a real, dangerous smile. He looked down at his hand, where a phantom weight of a copper ring seemed to rest. Julian, I've been a billionaire, and I've been a boy with holes in his shoes. I can tell you from experience. The boy with the holes in his shoes slept much better. Frank turned and walked out. He didn't look back at the chaos, the shouting, or the screens flickering to black. He walked out of the building, through the lobby, and into the cool Detroit air. He didn't take the SUV. He walked the 3 blocks to the diner with the blue sign. He found Alina in a corner booth. She had 2 orders of fries and 2 milkshakes waiting. She looked at him, searching for the executioner. She found only Frankie. Is it over? She asked. The company is gone, Frank said, sliding into the booth. He felt a lightness he hadn't known since he was 16. The money is being moved to the foundation. I kept enough for a small house and a used truck. I'm a nobody now, Alina, just like you asked. Alina reached across the table and took his hand. Not a nobody, Frank. You're the man who kept a promise, even if it took 20 years to find the right way to do it. As they sat in the quiet glow of the diner, Frank realized that his empire hadn't been the buildings or the billions. His empire was sitting right across from him, eating a fry and wearing a copper ring. But the shadow of their past still had one final secret to reveal, a secret that Alina had been keeping, something that would change the meaning of their 20-year separation forever. He thought he was the only one who had sacrificed everything. But as the rain began to drum against the diner windows, Alina Vance finally spoke the truth she had carried for 2 decades. The reason she disappeared wasn't because he left. It was because she had protected him from a secret that would have cost him his kingdom before it even began. The neon sign of the diner flickered, casting a rhythmic blue glow over the table. Frank Sterling, or rather, the man who was becoming Frankie Miller again, watched Alina's hands. She was twisting the copper ring, a nervous habit she'd had since she was 8 years old. The storm outside was a mirror of the one inside Frank's mind. He had walked away from billions, but the weight of the 20 years between them still felt like a mountain of lead. "You asked me earlier why I didn't say your name," Alina said, her voice barely a whisper above the hum of the refrigerator. "But there's something you never asked, Frankie. You never asked why I didn't come looking for you. You weren't hard to find. Your face was on the cover of every magazine. Your name was on the side of buildings." Frank felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the Detroit wind. I thought you hated me for leaving. I thought you saw the man I was becoming and wanted nothing to do with me." Alina looked up, and for the first time, Frank saw a flash of the fierce, protective girl from St. Jude. "I never hated you. I loved you enough to let you go. But there's a part of the story you don't know. The day the Vanderbilts came to take you, they didn't just talk to you. They talked to me, too." Frank's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "They were a powerful family, Frankie. They wanted a clean son, an heir with no ties to a gutter-born orphan girl. They saw how you looked at me. They saw that ring. The matriarch, Alina Vanderbilt, pulled me aside in the hallway while you were packing your things." Alina took a shaky breath. "She told me that if I ever contacted you, if I ever tried to be a part of your new life, she would make sure you were returned to the orphanage within 24 hours. She said she had the power to make sure you never got adopted again. She told me that your future, your education, your safety, your entire life, rested on my silence. She bought your freedom with my exile." Frank slammed his hand onto the table, the silverware rattling. "She threatened you, and you just let me go." "I was 14, Frankie," Alina's voice broke, a sob finally escaping. "I had nothing. No power, no money, no one to protect me. You were my only friend, and they told me I was the only thing standing in the way of your happiness. So I did what I had to do. I watched the car drive away. I spent every night for a year waiting for the phone to ring, praying you'd be brave enough to break their rules, but you never did. And as the years went by, I realized you were becoming exactly what they wanted you to be. You were becoming a Vanderbilt, a Sterling, a man who didn't need a girl with a copper ring." Frank felt the room spinning. For 20 years, he had lived with the guilt of being the one who abandoned her. He had built his walls out of a sense of self-preservation. But the truth was far more devastating. Alina had been his silent guardian. She had lived in poverty, worked in the shadows, and kept her distance not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much to let him fail. "I spent my whole life trying to be worthy of the life they gave me," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was being strong, but I was just a puppet. They used my love for you to control me, and they used your love for me to keep you away. We were both prisoners, Alina." He reached across the table and took both of her hands. "The money is gone now. The Vanderbilts are gone. The board is gone. There's no one left to threaten us. There's no more Sterling to protect." Alina looked at him, the blue neon light reflecting in the tears on her cheeks. "Then who are you, Frankie Miller, without the towers and the private jets? Who is the man sitting in front of me?" Frank looked at the copper ring on her finger, then at his own weathered, empty hands. "I'm the boy who owes you 20 years of sunrises. I'm the man who's going to spend every day for the rest of his life making sure you never have to be invisible again. I don't have a kingdom anymore, but I have a wrench, a used truck, and a heart that finally knows how to beat. The silence that followed wasn't the suffocating silence of the penthouse. It was the quiet of two souls finally finding the same frequency after a lifetime of static. I have something for you, Alina said, reaching into the small bag she had carried from her apartment. She pulled out a small, weathered wooden box. Inside was a second ring, identical to the first, but smaller. It was the one Frank had started making for himself that final night in the orphanage basement, but never finished. I went back for it, she whispered. The day after you left, I crawled into that basement and found it in the dirt. I finished it myself. She slid the copper wire onto Frank's finger. It was cold and rough, but to Frank, it felt more natural than any gold watch or designer cufflink. We're even now, she said with a watery smile. But as they sat there, two nobodies in a Detroit diner, the door opened and the cold wind blew in. It wasn't a hitman and it wasn't a board member. It was a young girl, no older than 7, clutching a frayed stuffed animal. She looked lost, her eyes wide with the same fear Frank and Alina had felt 20 years ago. Frank looked at Alina and he knew. His work wasn't finished. He had saved himself and he had found his soul, but the city was still full of children like them, children waiting for a promise that would actually be kept. He traded his penthouse for a porch and his billions for a second chance. Billionaire Frank Sterling is dead, and in his place stands a man who finally knows what it means to be rich. But as the sun sets over a new kind of empire, one question remains. Can a promise made in the dark truly survive the light of day? This is the final chapter of the man who lost everything to find his soul. The transition from Frank Sterling to Frankie Miller didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in the quiet, dusty corners of the city he had once tried to forget. Within 6 months, the headlines about the missing billionaire had faded, replaced by news of a massive, anonymous endowment that had turned St. Jude. From a crumbling relic into a state-of-the-art sanctuary for the city's forgotten children. Frank and Alina didn't move into a mansion. They bought a weathered, 2-story Victorian house 3 blocks from the community center. It had a wraparound porch that needed sanding and a kitchen that smelled of the real meals Alina finally had the time to cook. Frank's days were no longer filled with hostile takeovers. They were filled with the scent of sawdust and the weight of a hammer. He spent his time teaching the older boys at the center how to build, not just buildings, but lives. One evening, as the autumn chill began to bite, Frank sat on his porch, watching the sunset bleed orange and purple across the Detroit skyline. He looked down at his hands. They were calloused now, stained with grease and wood glue. On his ring finger sat the crude copper wire Alina had finished for him. Alina stepped out onto the porch, handing him a mug of coffee. She sat beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. They sat in a silence that was no longer a weapon, but a bridge. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The 20 years, the power, the world you walked away from?" Frank considered the question carefully. He looked at the copper ring, then at the woman who had protected his soul when he wasn't even aware he still had one. "I regret every day I stayed away," he said, his voice thick with a hard-earned honesty. "I regret the silence. I regret the man who thought a silk tie made him a king, but I don't wish I could change it." "Why not?" "Because if I had come back when I was 18, or 25, or 30, I would still have been the coward who left," Frank admitted. "I needed all those years to lose everything. I needed to see the top of the mountain to realize there was nothing up there but ice. I needed to become someone worthy of sitting next to you on this porch." Alina leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're still not worthy, Frankie Miller," she teased, though her eyes were shining. Frank smiled, a real, deep-bellied smile that reached his eyes. "I know, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the copper rings on their fingers caught the final, fatting light. For a brief second, the cheap metal didn't look like wire at all. It glowed with a radiance that no diamond could ever mimic. It was the glow of a promise that had been dragged through the mud, buried in the dark, and tested by the fires of greed, only to emerge unbroken. Some promises are born in poverty, made by children who have nothing but hope to keep them warm. Most of those promises break under the weight of time and circumstance. They shatter against the reality of a world that doesn't care about orphans or copper rings. But the ones that survive, the ones that find their way back after 20 years of silence, those are the promises that define the human spirit. Not because they were kept perfectly, but because someone, somewhere, refused to forget. Frank looked out at the city. He saw the lights of the community center flickering on. He saw a future that didn't belong to a billionaire, but to a man who had finally learned that the most valuable thing you can own is a piece of your past that you aren't ashamed to hold. The executioner was gone. The architect of silence had been silenced by love, and as the stars began to poke through the Detroit smog, Frankie Miller took a sip of his coffee, held his wife's hand, and finally, for the first time in his life, he went inside, and he slept. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to subscribe and join our family. We share stories like this every week, narratives about love, loss, and the incredible courage it takes to find our way back to the people who truly matter. We believe that no matter how far you've wandered, the road home is always open. And I'm curious, have you ever made a promise you couldn't keep? Or maybe someone made a promise to you that was broken, leaving a hole where hope used to be. How did you find peace with it? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most healing thing we can do is realize that we aren't alone in our shadows. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.